Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our exciting webinar. This is a part 2 of the event, and yesterday we had a fabulous day and a lot of great takeaways come out of that event. So this is part 2 of unlocking cash in your business. So once we start, we're going to go around and introduce everybody who they are, and then I will come back in a few minutes and we'll start the event. Michelle.
Yes, sir. I'm Michelle Eaton. I'm the Vice President of Public Affairs at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you all today.
Thank you. Okay, Bob Hill.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a senior finance professional. After leaving public accounting, I spent a lot of time with a lot of large multinationals, which formed a wonderful base in terms of what great practices look like. I've now taken that into a number of mid-cap companies and CFO roles, and with a couple of them being on the private equity side. And now I have a broad-based consulting practice.
Thanks, Bob. Brian Litwin. Brian.
Morning, everybody. I'm Brian Litwin from a firm, Litwin Muir. We're a boutique firm based in Toronto with a satellite office in South Africa and another in the Netherlands. We specialize in sales taxes, primarily GST, HST, BST in Canada, and value-added tax or VAT across the world. We do compliance work, advisory, strategy, and a lot of recovery work. So that's us. Looking forward to chatting with you guys later.
Thanks, Brian. Anne?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anne Falomo. I'm with Schooley Mitchell, and we are cost reduction specialists. I operate the Vaughan office, and my personal background is over 20 years in the accounting industry, working for food manufacturing and CPG companies.
Thanks, Anne. Doug?
Hi, everyone. I'm Doug Samuel. I'm the owner and operator of Shred Clinic, and I help businesses that are trying to advance technology in some way get business or money back from the government so they can spend it again. And I'm co-hosting today with Melanie.
Wonderful. Jason.
Hey, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Bruce. So Jason Sudbury, handles strategic partnerships for a company called OFX, and super excited to be a part of this this panel today. Yesterday's panel was amazing, so hopefully we can live up to the same standard that was set. Last 20 years in enterprise technology, more recently around fintech and the payment space, and hope today to share a few tips or ideas on how you can unlock some cash right away in your business as it relates to your payments.
Wonderful. And Melanie?
Morning, Melanie Russell, President of KLX Valuations. I'm a business and asset valuator, forensic accountant, and I look forward to co-hosting this with Doug this morning.
Wonderful. So we're going to get started, and I'm very proud to have our keynote speaker, Michelle Eaton, who's our keynote today from the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and I'm going to hand it off to her for her keynote, and then we'll come back, and then we'll go through the rest of the webinar. Michelle?
Awesome, and I'm so delighted to be here today, Bruce. Thank you for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk a bit about what we're doing, what the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is doing to support business through the pandemic and for economic recovery. I'm going to touch on some current affairs and what's going to help businesses thrive as Ontario reopens the economy. It's kind of interesting timing, actually, because we just released an SME report talking about some of the success stories we've seen across Ontario of small and medium-sized businesses who have adapted their business models to actually grow and achieve more success during this unprecedented time. So that's you can actually go to our website to check that out. It's called Small Business Big Impact: How SMEs Are Pivoting During COVID-19. And there's some really great profiles of different businesses from across Ontario. So for those of you who don't know the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, we are an independent, nonpartisan partner of business. So we have 60,000 members across Ontario. That is everything from a small family-owned business to large companies like 3M, GE, Bell. We represent 135 chambers of commerce and boards of trade from across the province, as well as their members. And we also have hundreds of corporate members, mostly located in and around the GTHA. So, and our purpose, our raison d'etre, is to support our members and advance business prosperity in the province. And the way we do that is through things like services, programs, advocacy, policy development, training, communications, webinars, kind of like today's, and events. And obviously, this is during this unprecedented time. Our engagement with our members has never ever been higher. When the pandemic first hit, we asked ourselves each day how we best can support Ontario's business community, and there's been unprecedented amounts of advocacy with every level of government. And the good news is, governments are responding and listening, some of these programs that they're rolling out, and there's a lot of programs that are providing short-term cash flow to business, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but governments are rolling out these programs in weeks rather than months, and then they're listening to feedback. The feds have a call every day where they're listening to feedback and adapting some of these programs, so it's really important to be aware of them, where there's opportunities to help support your business so that you can continue to thrive as the Ontario proceeds with economic recovery. And just a couple things, when we switched over our website to be a one-stop shop for Ontario business. If they had questions, government programs, business supports, working remotely supports, we put together a pandemic toolkit with the law firm Hicks Morley for organizations to understand some of their legal and HR responsibilities during a pandemic. And right now, a lot of our focus is on economic recovery measures with emphasis on health and safety. And we see that, the Ontario government and the federal government have been focused on things like contact tracing, safety measures. And we've also been looking at where businesses have fallen through the cracks, because there's been a lot of programs that have been rolled out and adapted to try to cover most of the Ontario's business community, or Canada's business community, but there's still outliers. So one of the things, with all these programs that have been rolling out, there's sometimes confusion for folks of where to go, what to do. There is a business resilience service hotline for entrepreneurs and small business owners that's run by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and open 7 days a week. So if you are looking for help, you can call 1-866-989-1080. So the importance of looking at what the provincial and federal governments have done. The provincial government, there's been ESA changes to support employers and employees. And there's also a new procurement portal for businesses looking for opportunities to support the COVID-19 relief efforts. And PPE supplier access, another thing we've heard from businesses is, how do I, get set up and make sure that I'm following all the rules to make sure that my consumers feel safe coming into my establishment. So it's important to make sure that their COVID-19 website is a great one-stop shop for all the information you need in terms of provincial legislative changes. And then the federal government has done a number of programs that can help support businesses with short-term measures at this time. So for example, the Government of Canada and Ontario announced a $15 million investment to help businesses across Canada adopt digital technologies. That's read through the development agent. FedDev Ontario would be where you'd go here to assist, and that'll assist nearly 23,000 Ontario businesses in embracing online commerce. Certainly something that we'll be seeing is a lot of folks moving to online touchless tech for their businesses. And then you will have probably noticed that the Ontario government, or the federal government, but now Ontario has the Ontario Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. A lot of business owners are either landlords or tenants. So this is, it provides forgivable loans to eligible commercial property owners experiencing rent shortfalls because their tenants have been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. What's new to that is the Ontario government recently announced a moratorium on evictions, which, however unfortunate, as the program's not, it's an imperfect program, and they're, I think, looking at ways to adjust it to improve it. They're trying to, make sure that businesses can still thrive and aren't left without a space, a physical space. And then for things like the Canadian Emergency Business Account loans, that's an interest-free loan of up to $40,000 to small businesses and non-for-profits to help cover their operating costs during a period where their revenues have been temporarily reduced. So on June 15th, the Government of Canada announced that those applications will be accepted so that more small businesses can access the program, such as owner-operated small businesses that have been ineligible to the program due to their lack of payroll, or sole proprietors receiving business income directly, as well as family-owned corporations remunerating in the form of dividends rather than payroll. So these are, some of the things that us as an organization and other business organizations have pushed for. And having the federal government and provincial government being so flexible and listening to the feedback from Canadians and Canadian business has just been phenomenal, and greatly appreciated. There's also, the government's rolled out wage subsidies. First, it was a 10% wage subsidy, and a number of businesses, organizations, including ourselves, pushed for a 75% wage subsidy so that businesses could keep their lights on and support their employees during this unprecedented time. There's also a large employer emergency financing facility program that helps some of the larger employers, and that's in place really just to help protect Canadian jobs. And those companies seeking support from that program actually need to demonstrate how they intend to preserve employment and maintain investment activities. So there's been lots of thought from the federal government on how to support Canadians, even with the business credit availability program. So that's targeted for small and medium businesses. And in April and May, they announced different changes to the program to adapt for larger financing needs. And so it's hard for people to keep up, but there's websites from the federal and provincial government with a number of different programs that will help support cash flows, temporary cash flows to business in this time until the province fully opens up. So, and even for businesses that don't fit, we're hearing from a lot of businesses that don't necessarily fit in some of these programs. So we have, there's also through the Canada's regional development agencies, there's funding that are flowing through them, and Community Futures Network. That's more, for rural businesses and communities, but there's a lot of funding through there. And as the programs have evolved during this time, I really encourage everyone to look on the federal and provincial websites on what's available to support you during this time. And then in terms of what's to come, so the province announced a framework for reopening the province. It's Protect, Restart, Recover. So we're right now in stage 2. The first stage was about opening select workplaces, allowing small gatherings. In stage 2, it's more of a regional approach. You might have noticed that Toronto and Peel just announced this week that they're opening businesses today. So you'll see more workplaces and outdoor spaces allowing larger gatherings. And then in stage 3, which I would say that could be about a month away, because you were still hearing announcements about stage 2 right now, but you'll see further relaxation of the restrictions on public gatherings, opening workplaces responsibly. I think you'll see probably that large public gatherings such as concerts, nightclubs, sporting events will continue to be restricted for the foreseeable future. And there'll still be a large emphasis on protection for vulnerable populations and continued practice of physical distancing, hand washing, all those things. The provincial government also has announced an Ontario Jobs and Recovery Committee to support the province's economic recovery efforts. And they're currently consulting Ontarians and business, and you can actually contribute to that conversation, and you should. I would encourage you to. You can actually send an email to submissions@ontario.ca because they're preparing the next phase of Ontario's economic action plan, which will be ready to launch as soon as we have containment measures in place. And I think going forward, you can expect governments will continue to respond and react to feedback from Canadians, business community, so that businesses can thrive and we can chart our path back forward to economic recovery. We can anticipate probably more partnerships between government and private sector, because you've seen a lot of private sector step up and help with COVID-19 relief efforts. I think the private sector will be instrumental in the recovery efforts, and that'll be an important voice. We'll be going into more of I think the new normal is going to be more digital, and it's not surprising, contactless world. And we'll be seeing more businesses, from our SME report, we've been seeing amazing examples of businesses that have adjusted their business models to set themselves up for success. And it's a beautiful thing. And I think we're going to see more and more creative solutions that come out of this. So it's been a very difficult time for many organizations, but there's been some positive innovations that have occurred. And there's, certainly, I have good feelings that the business community in Ontario will certainly step up and contribute greatly to the province's success. And I think I'll wrap it up for there.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Really appreciate your perspective on how you're helping Ontario businesses and your interface with different levels of government and how that's supporting businesses as well. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So we're going to bring in our panelists now. So the first thing that I'm wondering, a lot of businesses are facing a cash crunch right now. So what's the fastest way to get cash into your business right away?
Doug, I think one of the quickest ways to turn around cash that could be buried in businesses is in the form of GST, HST, QST, and if you trade internationally, value-added tax opportunities that you might be missing. These taxes all fall under the banner of value-added tax and appear to most businesses, and the actual structure of the tax is that it's a very easy tax to administer and work with, but it can be deceptively difficult. And it's a kind of a tax that is subject to errors, issues, leakage, referred to as VAT leakage. Every time a transaction incurring one of these taxes is mistreated, costs the business money. If it's missed input tax credit, it goes straight to the bottom line. If it's underreported output tax credits, it ends up in the penalties and interest costs. So statistics show that 87% of companies at some point don't take full advantage of the input tax credits and overstate output tax credits. There's good news, and the good news is that overlooked ITCs can be recovered and reclaimed within the statute of limitations periods, which in Canada is 4 years. So any entity can go back and recover any missed opportunities for the past 4 years. The turnaround time is very, very quick for the value-added taxes. PST, which we have in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, there are opportunities to recover sales taxes there. However, that takes quite a lot longer time. The various reasons I've often been asked, what are the reasons that cause sales tax mistreatment? Because it seems so easy and so simple. Well, there are multiple reasons. I'll give you a few. System modifications or improvements, software upgrades, legislative changes. Not so long ago in Ontario, we all experienced the restricted input tax credit issues, and that created problems for companies right to the very end. In fact, it was wound out at the middle of 2018. There's still issue. People are still recovering taxes that they overpaid in the RITC regime. Extraneous accounting entries, expanded employee roles, staff turnover, outsourcing shared services. And the one thing about sales tax, if it's been missed, it's out of sight and out of mind. People are in the business of their business. They don't really go back retroactively and look at issues and recovery where there's potential for recoveries. And they become blind spots. So that's from a Canadian perspective. Internationally, for companies trading internationally, it just gets, transactions get a lot more complex, and there are a lot more layers for VAT input taxes to disappear, and that companies don't have visibility to and are entitled to. For companies dealing in Europe, the EU plus other EU countries that aren't members of the EU have certain specific VAT directives to enable non-established companies in Europe incurring VAT in Europe to be able to recover it. There are also multiple different avenues to recover VAT within the EU if you registered in the EU. And essentially, sales tax is not as easy and as simple as it's made out to be. Talking about international trade, Jason, have you got any insights where you might be able to offer suggestions to turn it for some immediate recovery, immediate benefits or cash inflows?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that question, Brian. You know, you used an interesting term there, leakage. And I'd like to sort of follow that through a little bit. Payments, foreign exchange, it's kind of not necessarily the sexy part of the business. But, you know, over the years, I've seen that this is definitely an area where it's easily overlooked, but if you just pay a little bit of attention to it, you can unlock cash in all of those transactions. And so, you know, if we were live in a room, I might start off with, you know, this idea of where I ask everybody in the room to put up their hand and say that, you know, is everybody here aware of what rate they're paying, say on FX or any of their payments? And, you know, you get a good showing of hands. Everybody says, yeah, sure. And then, you know, the follow-up is, you know, who has a formal strategy in their business around payments and foreign exchange? And, you know, a bunch of hands actually come down, and that right away is telling me, you know, you're probably, you know, paying for more than you should on your transactions. And so that's money just kind of leaking out the door. And then I say, you know, the follow-up is anybody ever actually spoken directly to the dealer who's going to do that transaction, the actual international transaction? And, you know, almost everybody, the hand goes down. And so that's not surprising. So if you're in that boat, don't feel bad. Pretty much everybody is. And so maybe if in a couple of minutes here, I can just share a couple of ideas or just concepts that, you know, in my experience with very little effort and just some good analysis, you know, unlocking $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month for a moderate business that does, you know, 50 to 150,000 in cross-border transactions either way, is doable, right? And that's, you know, $36,000, $40,000 cash into your business for transactions that you're going to do anyway. And so with a little bit of analysis, you can fix that. And so that's the leakage. So with that, it's important to start with the idea of analysis. If you haven't done an actual analysis of what your inflows and outflows are, I highly recommend it. There's lots of experts out there, different vendors in the market that you can shop around. And you want to, once you start doing an analysis of what your inflows are, what your outflows are, you want to get a little bit more granular as into what those actual currencies are, because that will actually have an impact on your business, because different currencies are going to have different things you want to think about, impacts on it. And then you want to align that with your buy-sell cycle with your business. And so all of these things will go into an analysis. And then once you have that, you want to start thinking about different layers and how you're going to layer on this strategy. And so, three really quick ways to look at this at a very basic level. If you're doing any sort of transaction cross-border, or if you have any sort of FX, you really want to consider the ability to do that in the local currency. And I'll give you a use case. If you're buying from a vendor in China or India, and I'll just use India as an example, we've seen a lot of clients who sell in the US and then they say, well, I keep it in US because my vendor can invoice me in US. And it's like, okay, great. You have no FX. But what you may not know is when you drill down on those invoices is actually there's a 5% buffer built into that, right? So you're basically paying 5% more on every single one of those transactions. And so that's very common. Say in INR, if you're doing CAD or USD to INR to India, the supplier is going to build that in there. And so, in multiple use cases that we've analyzed, that's a very simple way of freeing up, 5% in those transactions. And so that immediately just goes into your bank account. That's cash. More the sort of advanced level, once you kind of address that, you might want to look at things like how do you manage the market and the fluctuations that are happening in the market to your advantage, right? And so if you're not familiar with different strategies around forwards and limit orders, the good news is you don't necessarily have to be an expert in it. There's experts out there, so that's the good news. But it's important to understand because if you have a buy cycle that in a currency that's fluctuating quite rapidly, you're definitely going to have leakage there. And this is quantifiable. This is math. You can just look at the invoices. You can look at historical data, and you can see that if you were transacting at certain spot rates, and spot meaning the rate on that day, and you compare that to somebody who maybe had a forward strategy and mitigated that fluctuation, thousands of dollars difference on moderate, again, $150,000, $100,000 worth of transactions. So, forwards and limit orders are definitely areas that if you have ongoing business, both on the buy side or on the sell side, I would highly recommend, because that's going to make a big impact to your business. So that's kind of one really high level area. And I'm trying not to get too far into the weeds here because, each one of these concepts we could do probably a whole webinar, but one other area I really recommend, we're seeing this a lot in the manufacturing space, is, manufacturers with COVID-19 going on, pivoting their business and moving a little bit more to a direct to consumer model. And, when they go online or maybe launch an e-commerce business, something that they don't traditionally do, this idea of now that I'm selling cross-border in a sort of electronic environment or e-commerce environment. And so what that does to actually eat away at your margins. And so the sort of the tip too, if I leave you with this, is, go out and look at this idea of, you'll hear them called different things: global currency account. You'll hear them called multi-currency accounts. And the reason these things are great is it gives you foreign bank accounts domiciled in that foreign region. So for instance, let's just say I'm selling into the UK. I'm receiving Great British pounds. It's good for my customers to pay me in that currency. If I'm doing that through, say, Visa, MasterCard, or PayPal, or some of these other things, you're going to pay a really high premium on that. Somewhere's up, 4-6%. Whereas these multi-currency accounts, you're going to be way, way down, probably 75% less on those conversion rates. And so there's an area, again, that leakage happens, right? Your sellers are quite happy to give you a credit card, but then it's eating into your margins on those transactions. And so, these multi-currency accounts allow you to receive that money and hold that money for a certain amount of time. You can move it back and usually move it around cheaper. And the nice thing is what Bruce was saying about VAT payments. Well, you never want to convert your money once and then convert it back again, because I got a tax bill in the UK. And so I can leave a certain amount of that money there, and I can pay out of that and pay my VAT tax there, and again, avoid that sort of leakage and impact. And so that's going to free up cash in your business right away. And so with that, that's two major concepts, and I don't want to belabor the point here in interest of time, but just sort of the last one I would say is, don't be afraid to combine different solutions in your strategy. So I mentioned this idea of forwards. They're a great tool, but they're a bit counterintuitive, right? So a forward is the idea that I'm going to secure some funds in the future, but you have to put a deposit down on that. So that's your working capital gets tied up. And that can be a bit counterintuitive. We're talking about unlocking cash after all. And it can be as high as 15% of your forward. So if you're a manufacturer and you've got an extended forward contract that's working in your favor, look at other things that you can bolt to that. So Export Development Canada has a great product. I believe it's called FXG. It's a bit of a word salad of what it is, but you can look it up. Export Development Canada, FXG, and this is it basically allows you to finance that forward at a very low rate. And then it frees up that capital for you. And so think about combining these different solutions out there in and around your payments. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I look at these every day, and with a very simple half-hour review of your payments, it's is freeing up $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month realistic? Absolutely. And that's, again, I always go back to the point of that's stuff you're doing anyway. You're not making an investment. This is transactions you're already doing, and it goes right into your pocket at the end of the day. So yeah, that's kind of at a very granular level. It's very niche, but yeah, it can definitely help you, and you can start literally doing that today.
So questions come up to Brian. So you'd mentioned that managing sales tax, should be pretty easy. Aren't the systems that handle this pretty much foolproof?
That's a very good question. Systems, as in software systems, you'd think of foolproof. They're programmed to record exactly what they're supposed to record. But it's the human intervention is where you have problems. My classic example, I was doing work at a company that's on the Forbes 50 list. So they didn't skimp on costs, on personnel costs, etc. I uncovered a systems issue. And that systems issue turned into a mid-7-figure recovery immediately for the prior 4 years. You compute what it must have, what had slipped through for the 18 years before that this company was doing exactly the same thing, and they never picked it up. Subsequent to the recovery, they were well off that. They plugged the hole. We guided them exactly what they needed to do to plug the hole and stop the leakage, and they're saving themselves $2 million a year. But it happens, and you'd never ever think that it would. They had one of the top softwares in place, a major ERP system. Once again, it reminds me the CFO of a large global company, when I was telling her what we do and the recovery concept, she looked at me after arguing and questioning, and she said, you're absolutely right. You don't know what you don't know. And that's the truth.
Yeah, if I might just interject there, not that I know Brian's expertise, but my 20 plus years in enterprise technology, and that's a great question about systems that are available. Yeah, there's great systems out there. They automate. There's specialist systems. You see all kinds of SaaS vendors, and there's some really good tools out there. But to Brian's point, don't just assume that the solution you implement will just take care of everything for you. You still need to do the analysis, the follow-up, the confirmation to make sure that you don't have that leakage or that something's missed in the setup of that system. But yeah, great point.
Great. Thanks to Brian and Jason for sharing their insights regarding actions that businesses can take now to deal with these current issues and help to unlock cash. But everyone knows, and as an evaluator, I know that long-term is important to survival. And short-term, however we're defining short-term these days, I'm not sure, but hopefully it's somewhat short-term that we have to deal with the pandemic-related issues. So on a long-term basis, anyone on the panel have some suggestions for businesses unlocking cash on a long-term basis?
I'll take that one, if I may. There's been a lot of discussion about unlocking cash from an inflow point of view, but outflow is just important. And in terms of leakage, you can have leakage in all areas of your expense categories. So when you're looking towards ways for your business to unlock cash in the long term, it's important to be strategic, and it's important to have a cost management strategy that manages those outflows. And a couple of things that businesses need to think about when they're thinking of their cost management strategy is, one, does it align with their overall business strategy? Because you don't want to be making a decision about cutting a cost category that's ultimately going to impact a growth that your business has in mind. Or, if you're going to say, I'm going to slash my marketing budget, but why aren't I hitting my growth targets? They're not necessarily disconnected. So it's very important when you're thinking of managing your outflows as a ways to maximize cash, that it's aligning with your overall business goal. Another thing is just understanding your baseline expenses. How much am I spending right now across all business categories? Businesses in my experience tend to focus on the big buckets, right? The 80-20 rule. I'll focus on where I spend 80% of my funds, but sometimes there's a lot of opportunity in that 20%. And if that 20% represents $100,000, and there's leakage of anywhere from 10 to 50% on that $100,000 expenditure, which I have seen in the past, that's up to $50,000 that you're leaving on the table that your business can have available to you as cash. I'd say the third thing to think about is also benchmarking. What are my competitors spending? And this is information that's not always available, but you don't want to be overspending relative to your competitors, particularly in categories that are not, let's call it, core business categories. There's a quote from Sam Walton where you spending less than your competitors can be an absolute competitive advantage, and allows you to have margin control, extra cash flow, compounding effects of just hanging on to that extra $10,000, $50,000, $100,000 is pretty significant. And kind of the last tip maybe for businesses when they're thinking about managing their costs is taking action. Like, don't assume that because you already spent, X on telecom or waste or whatever service you're looking at, that's what you should be spending. Call your vendors, find out if they have better rates, find out if they're making concessions, especially during this COVID time. We've had clients that had to suspend their waste management services. And trust me, if they didn't call to ask for that, or if we didn't call to ask for that on their behalf, they'd be paying that bill, and that's a cash outflow they can't really afford right now. So don't be afraid to call your vendors and find out what concessions are available, what new rates are available, and that can be a significant impact on your bottom line. And I would say those kind of fall into the category of low-hanging fruit. In terms of having a probably more structured long-term impact on your cost management, one of the tools I absolutely recommend is zero-based budgeting. And it's not widely used except maybe in government or non-profit environments, but what it really does is allow you to assume that you need to justify every single penny you're spending, as opposed to what a lot of businesses do, which is, well, as long as it's the same as last year, that's fine. Or maybe last year plus 2% for inflation, or maybe last year minus 5% for cost cutting. If you had to justify every single line of spend, you would find opportunities that you probably didn't think about because you assumed, you'd always spend that much. Another area to look at is one that people don't generally look at, and that's labor, particularly where it's labor that's considered a fixed overhead or an admin. Direct labor is typically easier to manage, and there have been layoffs in the COVID environment. But generally what you want to do is maybe look at some of those fixed costs that are either labor or non-labor generated, but assume they're not fixed anymore and see if there's an opportunity to have savings. There is a word of caution, and I think Bob can speak to that, is you definitely don't want to cut the muscle in your business. So you want to be strategic, again, about where you're cutting those costs, and Bob can definitely speak to the labor element of that. So Bob, I feel free to pipe in.
Great. Thanks very much, Anne. As you said, and I think as all of our panelists have pointed out, there's a lot of great opportunities to take existing costs out of the business. Excuse me. Where I'd like to go with the discussion a little bit is around doing things differently. Obviously, the best source of cost savings out of doing things differently is identifying your cost structure and what's in there and may be able to be taken out if you start to operate and run your business differently. And I think this is a prime environment in which people have an opportunity to stand back from how they're doing business and saying, what happens if we change? And we all know what happens to businesses where they don't adapt to the times. So from my perspective, one of the tools for identifying inefficiency, which I've broadly used, has been Kaizen events. And for those aren't familiar with Kaizen events, it's really taking an opportunity to understand what your as is. So if you're looking at a particular process, then how are you currently functioning within that process? And what are some of the inefficiencies that are coming out of that particular process? And then start to move towards a future state where you are operating differently and you're eliminating a lot of the inefficiency. What I can give you an example with a client that I'm working on right now is they're looking at trying to reduce their packaging costs. And when you start to look at specifically packaging costs, you say, all right, it's high. How do we go about dealing with it? And I think through a Kaizen event, which again is it's getting a team of people together, subject matter experts. You stretch it over a few days, but you really start to generate ideas about what you can do differently. So one of the things that's come out of this initiative in reducing packaging is the absence of an S&OP process. So that's where sales and operations get together, and you're trying to link demand to supply. Well, if you don't have a good S&OP process, then there's all sorts of costs that you incur. It's obviously going to be inefficiencies in terms of not negotiating with your suppliers to get the best pricing out there. It may be incurring overtime to produce products. It may be a write-off of inventory because you produced more products than you should, or you're not in tune with changing consumer patterns. So I find that these events are highly effective in getting at low-hanging fruit right away, and may lead into more strategic changes over time. But it's the power of getting a group of people together. So when you start to talk more about labor, I've talked about one area right away on the inefficiency side is potentially overtime. But if, again, you're lining your sales and your operations in a better manner, then you may be able to schedule production a whole lot differently. And that's going to start to take out labor costs. Because obviously what you want to do on the labor side is, and throughout the organization, is to drive efficiencies and take out waste. But when you start to get into cutting labor, that's scary. And I think it's scary for everyone, because if you get it wrong, you're going to damage your business. And I've watched a company that I was closely affiliated with truly damage their business. They were under a lot of pressure on the private equity side to reduce costs, and they reduced costs. They took the costs out of the system, but they did so on the basis that they weren't going to impact the top line. Well, they did in a very significant way, because at that stage, they weren't cutting out fat, they were cutting out muscle. And for most organizations, unless you start to look at doing things differently, it's going to be very difficult to just cut. When you start to get into a production type environment, sometimes it's about understanding where your costs are coming from. So if you've got different lines operating within a plant, then it's using carting systems, for example, to truly understand where your labor dollars are being invested. There was Harvard some time ago did a study, and for the life of me, I cannot find it. So, but honestly, I'm not making it up. But it was called The Mythical Man, and it was all about as you are operating a business and you hit a stage and you say, "Well, I got to add headcount," and when you're doing it in a labor environment at times, then what people don't realize is you've got that law of diminishing returns. So it's the whole concept at times that the work expands to fill the number of people that are there. So I think it is an opportunity once again to stand back and look at the activities that are taking place, and looking at what activities can potentially be eliminated, which allows you to reduce your labor costs as well. Another area that I would talk to is setting priorities within an organization. And this one sounds simple, but I found few organizations do it well. And for me, going back to some of the large multinationals that I commented on in the past, was my time at Campbell Soup years ago. And I watched a CEO come in, completely change the priorities of the organization to focus on ready to serve soups. When we finally launched a new line of soups, adjusting for market size, it was the most successful launch in the history of Campbell Soup globally at the time. And it was done extremely well. I believe there's a best-in-class process for everything. And it was done exceptionally well. And what happened ultimately was a hugely successful launch, and it was through discipline. So I really want to encourage people to stand back, look at how you can do business differently, and make some ruthless choices. Because if you try and do everything, you're not going to be successful. You're going to address the priorities that create enough noise, or as much, create the most noise at a point in time, instead of the things that, back to Melanie's comment, are most strategic and are going to help your business over the longer term.
Bob, I have a question for you. You'd mentioned that you want to avoid cutting muscle. Are there any expenses that look like they're not muscle, even when you analyze it, and then you find, oops, we didn't really understand that part of our business? Or is it usually pretty straightforward?
No, and I think the reality is, when you get into the labor side, some of the cuts you might make, you think are in fact fat, but when you start to experience the implications of making those cuts, you find that they are starting to have an impact on the business. And I think what's important is that you move at a pace that allows you to truly assess the impact on the business, instead of doing a massive restructuring where you're all in, so to speak.
Yeah, thanks, that makes sense. And Bruce, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. There's been quite a few Q&As, so why don't we take a few moments and go through some of the Q&As during the last few minutes of the session. And we'll go through some of these. There were some Q&As. Michelle, did you want to take on the Q&As that early on, that there was a couple there? Did you want to take those on and discuss those?
Sure. So there's one question about, yeah, the expanded SEVA is still not available, and they're asking if any information from feds on when rollout will be. It was supposed to be June 19th, yes. And on June 19th, Finance Minister Bill Morneau announced that they were putting a pause on the launch that day, and that they were going to work around the clock to make sure that they can get that funding out securely. From my understanding is that there'll be announcements soon with a revised timeline for that one. That's not much intel, but hopefully we'll have a better understanding of that. And then there was another question about business improvement areas. Do they have online group presence? So there's actually a business improvement area association, and there's lots of stuff on the web about it, but you'd probably be best to call, if you just Google Business Improvement Area Association, that's probably your best bet for that one.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
There was another question that came out. The fixed variable expense ratio, called the FV, can vary across business, sometimes 30%, 70%, or the other way, 70-30, where the fixed variable expense is higher. What are steps to control these fixed costs? Rob, you want to take that on, Bob?
In terms of, I think, looking at some of the fixed costs, it's a challenge, I think, to understand what's truly fixed and what's truly variable, because I think it all happens within certain levels of activity. And I think as the activity starts to decline, then I think you've got to be able to stand back and look at your fixed costs in regards to the lower activity. And I always look at fixed costs as being more step in nature. obviously there's a base amount of fixed costs that you need to operate the organization. But as you start to ramp down, there's certainly fixed costs that can be taken out that are now congruent with a lower level of activity.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would agree. I just say that's an excellent point. Most people think of fixed costs in terms of scaling up, but actually if you're ramping down or reverse scaling, you can also take fixed costs out of your expenditure by looking at what you don't need to commit to at your level of activity. And outsourcing can be a valid option to get you out of those fixed cost commitments.
Thank you. And there's a question for you that also came up. Are there typical benchmarks that businesses can use to evaluate their costs, such as IT spend to revenue?
There are. The challenge with benchmarks is they can be very industry specific and size of enterprise specific, but there are a couple of studies out there that can give you kind of a range that you should be at. Definitely for IT spend, depending on your industry, it could be anywhere from 3 to 20%. And there are some studies available that drive down. What I would look to for in terms of reliable statistics, Statistics Canada has some amazing information available about IT spend by business category, and some consulting firms also publish their findings based on their customer base. Deloitte is a good one to look at.
Thank you. Thank you. And Bob, back to you. So you can read the question. There's a question here. How will the uncertainty around COVID-19 and possible occurrences import or influence human capital discussions, especially as our economy is growing up? And how do you factor this into workforce decisions?
Yeah, I think it talks in part to taking a flexible approach in terms of hiring. I think that rather than necessarily bring in an employee with commitment to full-time work, I think it opens up the opportunity to bring in people on a contract basis for a shorter period of time. And this is often a good marketplace for being able to use contract to perm situations where you have the opportunity, you've got some flexibility dependent upon how things unfold in the marketplace. And I think especially given this ramp up, which I think people generally expect is going to be fairly uneven. So I think having flexibility by using contract resources can help. And as you've done with your business, Bruce, on the CFO side, using a fractional CFO or part-time resources again can help support businesses.
Thank you. Thank you. A question came up here for Jason, and you may have touched on this. What do you typically see, like how does it work with the relationship that you have with the bank? And does it affect my relationship with the bank at all in terms of using your services? One person said he uses at the bank, and if you flick a switch, how does that relationship work?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, that's a great question because it's important to have a good relationship with your banking provider. The short answer is it generally has no impact at all on your relationship with your banking provider. Generally it works this way. If you're in that kind of top 0.5%, 1% of large enterprise in Canada, you're going to have that treasury relationship with your banking provider most likely. But as we kind of get into the sole prop SME side, you don't have that treasury kind of relationship. You're just not doing the volumes. Sort of being careful of this. The bank is more interested in the loans and deposits side of your business. The FX component is probably fairly limited, and so this is the area where you can look to a specialist in that area to kind of maximize the benefit to your business. But in terms of the relationship with your bank, I've never seen any instance where it's been an issue. And in fact, large enterprises usually maintain both because they want to they're really just playing the market for the best benefit for their business.
Okay. A question came in for Brian too. Brian, how does my company, I'm in a company and I want to introduce your services to my company. What's the best way of doing that? Because I've seen there's a hesitation that you might uncover something that somebody might be afraid you uncovered it, which jeopardizes my vulnerability and my own vulnerability. How do I go about doing that?
That's a good question, Bruce. There is hesitation at certain mid-management level because that it might show up inefficiencies. But really, from a high level, it's an improvement process. It's no different to any other process that you bring in to improve the business. It's the sell is that it's a benefit, or a benefit, and or it can identify that you're operating perfectly.
Okay. Thank you. And one last question for Michelle. You mentioned earlier that that you represent a bunch of boards of trade. So if I'm a member of, let's say, Aurora Board of Trade or another board of trade, I'm automatically a member of Ontario Chamber of Commerce. Like, how does it work with the memberships? I wasn't sure how that kind of plays out. Is that a separate membership, or am I automatically signed up?
Yeah, if you're a member of a Board of Trade or Chamber of Commerce across Ontario, you are a member of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's automatic. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have come to an end of the session. It was wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle, once again for being the keynote. That was fabulous. And thank you, Brian, Jason, Doug, and Bob, myself, okay, and Melanie. It was a great session today, and we had a great turnout. And have a wonderful day. And we'll be back to everybody too. There'll be some information sent out afterwards, after this session. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks,
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Bruce. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.